They fired me on a Monday morning, just 5 days before the single deadline that kept the company alive. For 10 years, I was the only one who knew how to file the federal compliance report. The codes, the exceptions, the hidden boxes. Miss it, and everything stops. Sales, shipments, payments. By Friday at midnight, they would discover the cost of firing the one person who held the key. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever been underestimated or pushed aside, trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. They called it a meeting, but it wasn't. I knew it the second I walked into Richard Hale's office Monday morning and saw Karen Lopez from HR sitting stiffly at the side of his desk with a folder already open. Richard didn't look up from his papers right away. He liked to stretch moments like taffy, making people squirm. When he finally did, he adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat like he was about to deliver something noble. "Emily," he said, "you're not a good cultural fit anymore." That line was supposed to soften the blow, but all it did was expose the hollow arrogance of a man who thought culture was something you could buy in bulk at an off-site retreat. Karen pushed the folder across the desk, pages neatly stapled, signature line waiting for me. "Mutual separation," she said, eyes darting down like even she didn't believe it. Mutual, like I had walked in that morning eager to hand over 10 years of my life in exchange for a pat on the head and a deactivated badge. Richard leaned back, satisfied with his phrasing, already moving on in his mind. He had no idea what Friday midnight meant. He had no idea that for a decade, I was the one who filed the compliance reports that kept this company breathing. Not just filling in blanks, knowing the system's quirks, the way a missing checkbox could sink the entire submission, the way one mistyped code could delay approval for months. It wasn't in a handbook. It wasn't in training materials. It lived in my head because I built it piece by piece when no one else bothered to learn. But to him, I was just paperwork. Replaceable. Culture clash. I took the folder, skimmed the legalese without really reading it, and signed. Not out of weakness, but out of calculation. Silence was sharper than protest. I gathered my things, planner, pen, a half-dead plant, and walked out without a word. Karen exhaled like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. Richard smiled faintly, already checking his watch. He thought the meeting was over. What he didn't understand was that the clock had just started ticking, and it would run out on him, not me. The compliance filing wasn't glamorous, but it was lethal if ignored. Every year, the federal system demanded absolute precision, and every year I was the one who navigated its labyrinth. The form itself looked ordinary, rows of boxes and codes, but beneath it were hidden traps. A single unchecked field could reject the whole package. A mistyped exemption code could lock the system for weeks. I had learned it the hard way during my first year when the system bounced my draft 3 times before I realized the portal demanded a specific sequence of attachments. No one taught me. I taught myself. Over time, I built a private map of its quirks, a kind of muscle memory for regulations. I never documented it. Not because I wanted power, but because no one ever asked. Richard Hale only cared that the filing was submitted on time and that the company avoided penalties. He never looked closer. Neither did the board. To them, it was routine, a background hum they assumed would always be there. They didn't see the nights I stayed past midnight when the system froze, or the weekends I tested scenarios so Monday wouldn't bring disaster. The codes became second nature, the timing instinctive. By the 10th year, I could glance at the form and know which combination would pass, which attachments had to be hidden until the final step, which exception only triggered in April if the revenue crossed a certain threshold. It wasn't knowledge you could pick up in a day. It wasn't something you could Google. It lived in the muscle memory of repetition, in the scars of mistakes I had already paid for. Daniel Price, the junior analyst they thought could step in, had shadowed me for a month but never asked the right questions. He copied workflows without understanding why they worked. To him, it was just data entry. To me, it was survival. When Richard fired me, he thought he was removing a cog. What he actually did was pull the one piece of wiring that kept the entire machine running, and the machine, left without its map, was headed for a wall only I could see. I didn't argue when they slid the papers across the desk. I didn't plead, didn't raise my voice, didn't even ask for an explanation. People like Richard expected a scene, some desperate attempt to claw back a job, a storm of tears or rage to make themselves feel justified. I gave him nothing. Silence is sharper than any protest, and mine cut clean. Karen Lopez, the HR director, rehearsed her lines about mutual agreement, as if the word mutual could disguise a firing delivered without warning. She avoided my eyes, already uncomfortable with the fiction she was paid to recite. I gathered what little I kept in my office, a planner thick with coded notes only I could read, a pen worn smooth from years of margin scribbles, and a half-dead plant that had survived 3 winters under fluorescent lights. I left the framed certificates on the wall. They meant nothing now, not to me, and certainly not to them. Daniel Price, the junior analyst, hovered near the cubicles when I walked past, pretending to focus on his screen. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The blank look on his face told me he understood less than anyone else what my absence meant. He thought the work was just forms, deadlines, routine. He had no idea how much lived in the gaps between the rules. I walked out without saying goodbye, my badge already deactivated by the time I reached the elevator. The company prided itself on efficiency, and they executed erasure with surgical speed. No Slack message, no farewell email, no headshot on the website by the end of the day. Clean sweep. They thought they were writing me out of the story. What they didn't realize was that I was stepping aside to let the story turn against them. The week crawled by, each day another tick on the clock that only I seemed to hear. Monday afternoon, the office went back to business as if I had never existed. Richard Hale walked the halls with his chest out, telling anyone who'd listen that the company was moving forward, that culture was about fresh ideas and new energy. He didn't mention the filing, not once. Tuesday, Daniel Price sat at my old desk, fumbling through spreadsheets, clicking through folders he didn't understand. He emailed Karen Lopez twice asking where the instruction binder was. Of course, there wasn't one. Angela Miller, the operations manager, noticed the shift more quickly than anyone else. She'd been around long enough to know the filing was due, and she sent Richard a polite reminder in the morning. Compliance deadline, Friday midnight. He brushed her off with a confident wave. Daniel has it handled, he said, the kind of empty assurance that sounded fine in a meeting but collapsed in reality. Angela didn't push, but I could tell by the way she asked follow-up questions in staff chats that she felt the unease rising. By Wednesday, the nervous energy spread. Quiet glances across cubicles, half-finished sentences about deadlines, the kind of murmurs that die the moment a manager walks past. Richard was in back-to-back calls with potential investors, boasting about quarterly projections while ignoring the filing altogether. Daniel clicked around the portal for hours but never once asked for help. He thought he was navigating a form. He didn't know he was walking a minefield. By Thursday, the cracks widened. Angela sent 2 more reminders, more direct this time. She flagged the deadline in bold red on the team calendar, but Richard didn't even read the alerts. He was already focused on a Friday dinner with potential clients. That night, Daniel stayed late, staring at error messages that meant nothing to him. He sent an email at 11:47 p.m. with the subject line, "Question about exemption codes." No one replied. Friday morning came heavy, the office quiet in the way it gets before a storm. Angela circulated again, this time stopping by Richard's office to remind him face to face. He waved her off, repeating the same line. Daniel has it covered. At lunch, Daniel looked pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He told a colleague in the break room he almost had it, but needed to triple-check a few entries. They nodded, not knowing what those words really meant. From the outside, I watched. I still had friends who texted, whispering updates. Each message confirmed what I already knew. No one had learned what I knew. The codes, the exceptions, the hidden boxes, they weren't documented anywhere. They lived in me, and I was gone. That week was the longest countdown of my life, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I had to wait for them to discover it on their own. By Friday night, the storm would land, and I wouldn't have lifted a finger. Friday dragged into evening, the office lights burning later than usual, shadows stretching across empty cubicles as the clock ticked toward midnight. Most weeks, people would have already gone home by 6, but that night Richard Hale insisted on a war room session, pulling a half-dozen managers and Daniel Price into the conference room with coffee and stale sandwiches. Angela Miller sat with her laptop open, eyes fixed on the federal portal, reminding anyone who would listen that the system would lock at 12 o'clock sharp. Richard waved her concern away, his tie loosened, his voice falsely calm as he declared, "We'll have this wrapped up in no time." At 11:15 p.m., Daniel submitted the form for the first time. The rejection came instantly. Red text splashed across the screen. Error. Field invalid. He tried again, copying the numbers line by line, whispering under his breath like a student repeating an answer key. Another rejection. Error. Incomplete. He clicked through tabs, adjusting one field then another. Nothing worked. Richard leaned over his shoulder, snapping, "Just fix it." Daniel's hands trembled. He had no idea what to fix. At 11:30, panic began to seep into the room. Angela tried to step in, asking Daniel which exemption codes he had selected, but he couldn't explain. He'd picked them at random, hoping one would stick. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "It should work." Richard barked at Karen Lopez to call compliance, as if there were a hotline that could bail them out. Karen just stared at him, phone in her hand, knowing full well no one would answer at that hour. The federal system didn't care about panic. It cared about precision, and precision had left the building on Monday morning. At 11:45, Daniel attempted his 5th submission. The rejection was slower this time, like the system itself was growing tired of him. Error. Sequence violation. He blinked at the message, completely lost. Angela leaned closer, reading the text, her face draining of color. She had seen me handle this before. She knew there was a sequence, a hidden order to the steps. But she also knew no one had ever written it down. Richard slammed his hand against the table, his calm facade cracking. "Try again," he snapped, though Daniel's eyes were glassy with exhaustion. Sweat gathered at his temple as he clicked desperately, navigating menus he didn't understand. Each attempt was slower, more frantic. At 11:52, Richard picked up his phone and barked into it, calling someone from the board, insisting that everything was under control. Angela whispered to Karen, "We're not going to make it." Karen just shook her head, eyes fixed on the countdown clock glowing in the corner of the portal. At 11:55, Daniel tried again. Error. Invalid attachment. He cursed under his breath, frantically deleting and reloading documents. "What attachment?" Richard demanded, leaning closer, but Daniel had no answer. He was fumbling in the dark, swatting at shadows. At 11:57, the room fell silent. The only sound was the steady click of Daniel's mouse, his breath quick and shallow. He tried one final time, hitting submit like a gambler throwing dice on the last roll. The screen hung for a moment, spinning, processing. Richard leaned forward, holding his breath. Then, rejection. Error. Non-compliant entry. The clock in the corner read 11:59. There was no time for another attempt. Angela closed her laptop softly, as if marking the end of a chapter. Daniel slumped in his chair, eyes wide, mouth dry. Richard barked orders no one followed, his voice growing louder, emptier with each command. Then, at exactly 12 a.m., the portal locked. A final message appeared on the screen in bold, merciless text. Deadline expired. System closed. At 12:01, the shutdown notice arrived by email, hitting every executive inbox simultaneously. Operations suspended, sales frozen, shipments blocked, payments stopped. No appeals, no grace period. The system didn't care about excuses. It only cared about the clock, and the clock had run out. The silence after midnight was louder than any alarm. At 12:01 a.m., the federal system executed exactly what it was built to do. It locked them out. The shutdown notice was blunt, bureaucratic, and merciless. No special phrasing, no sympathy. Just a single line of text confirming suspension of operations until the next review cycle. Inside the office, I could imagine the scene unfolding. Richard Hale, red-faced and snapping at everyone in sight, demanding answers that no one had. Daniel Price frozen in his chair, staring at the rejection screen like it might change if he blinked hard enough. Angela Miller, already pale from hours of watching the clock tick down, probably closing her laptop with finality, knowing nothing more could be done. Karen Lopez fielding panicked calls from department heads, while she herself had no script to follow. They had reached the point of no return, and there was nothing left to hide behind. The first consequences appeared within minutes. Order queues failed to process, leaving invoices stranded in the system. Trucks already loaded were barred from departure, flagged as carrying non-compliant shipments. Payments from major clients froze mid-transaction, the funds trapped in limbo. Dashboards across the company filled with red error messages. Notifications flooded executive inboxes like a tidal wave, each one another nail in the coffin. By 12:15, the supply chain was paralyzed. By 12:30, automated alerts began reaching customers, warning them their accounts had been suspended. By 1 a.m., the penalties started accumulating, each hour costing hundreds of thousands. The system was unforgiving, designed that way so companies would never dare miss the deadline. Richard, I was certain, tried to bluff his way through, calling board members and insisting it was just a hiccup. But you can't bluff a locked portal. The agency didn't care about his authority, his reputation, or his speeches. The system responded only to precision, and precision was gone the moment I left the building. At home, I sat at my desk with the soft glow of my monitor. I still had access to the alert streams because I'd routed them years ago to a private account no one bothered to disconnect. The error messages came in one after another, relentless and cold. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply read them like a physician watching a patient flatline, the vital signs slipping into silence. By 2 a.m., the company's largest contracts had already triggered termination clauses. By morning, investors would wake up to headlines of failure. There was no backdoor fix, no emergency override. The next review cycle was 3 months away, and until then, the firm was dead in the water. The irony was that Richard always prided himself on control. He strutted around as if he were the architect of every success. Yet here he was, powerless, undone not by sabotage, but by his own arrogance. He had underestimated the quiet woman in the compliance office, dismissed her as paperwork, and in doing so, removed the only safeguard he had. That was the collapse. Not loud, not violent, but absolute. And I hadn't lifted a finger to make it happen. I had only stepped aside and let time deliver the verdict. The collapse didn't end with the midnight lockout. That was just the first crack in the dam. The weeks that followed turned the company's name into a whispered cautionary tale, each day pulling another thread loose until the fabric gave way entirely. By the end of the first week, clients began to call in fury. Long-standing partners demanded explanations for frozen shipments, unpaid invoices, and the sudden inability to process orders. Richard Hale sent out carefully worded memos, each one stuffed with phrases like temporary disruption and minor administrative error. But clients weren't fooled. They didn't see a temporary glitch. They saw a company incapable of fulfilling its promises. By the second week, the board was panicking quietly behind closed doors. Investors who once bragged about their stake in the logistics firm now distanced themselves. Calls went unanswered, commitments went unrenewed. Angela Miller resigned with no ceremony, her resignation email clipped and cold. "I won't be held responsible for leadership's failures." Her departure sent shockwaves through the remaining staff, many of whom began updating resumes in silence. Inside the office, morale collapsed faster than the systems. Daniel Price, buried under a mountain of rejection notices and client complaints, unraveled. He was seen pacing hallways at odd hours, muttering about codes he didn't understand. Before disappearing entirely, his desk cleared one Monday morning without a word. HR scrambled to patch the bleeding wound, but Karen Lopez had nothing to offer except form letters and hollow reassurances. Paychecks were delayed, benefits questioned, and whispers of layoffs became daily background noise. Richard tried to hold it together, parading his usual bravado in front of whoever was still willing to listen. But the cracks in his voice gave him away. The empire he had boasted about was crumbling, and there was no speech left to save it. From my kitchen table, I read the trade headlines with steady calm. Logistics leader paralyzed by compliance breakdown. Hale's future in doubt. Each line was a confirmation. I hadn't sabotaged them. I hadn't broken a law. I had simply left. And without me, the entire machine they relied on collapsed under the weight of its own negligence. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't a scream, but the silence that lets arrogance destroy itself. I didn't hack a system. I didn't stage a coup. I didn't slam the table demanding recognition. I simply stepped aside, and the clock I had managed for a decade ticked to zero without me. This story is a reminder that in the modern workplace, true value often lies in quiet expertise, the knowledge that doesn't appear in job descriptions or flashy presentations. Emily Carter wasn't the CEO. She wasn't the face of the company, but she was the spine holding the operation upright. When leadership dismissed her as replaceable, they revealed how little they understood about the hidden work that keeps a business alive. For American workers, this lesson cuts deep. Respect isn't just a courtesy, it's survival. Companies that treat employees like disposable tools eventually learn that systems don't run on slogans or culture statements. They run on people who know how to make them work. The moral is not about destruction for its own sake. Emily didn't need to break anything. She let the natural consequences unfold. The revenge was simply allowing carelessness to meet reality. And that's where the high value lies. Arrogance collapses on its own, but foresight and integrity endure. How to get started today. Recognize your unique knowledge. Write down the skills you have that no one else sees. Set boundaries. Don't let others treat your expertise as disposable. Invest in your own growth, so your value isn't tied only to one place or one boss. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is proof. Your silence can be louder than their dismissal. Comment below with your own experience. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that show what happens when power forgets who really holds the keys.